All right, we'll get started in just one more minute. All right, let's go ahead and get started. Welcome everybody to Getting Back to School. Is there promise or peril in online learning? We're excited for today's webinar with over 1,200 people registered. I'm Claire Crawford with In the Public Interest, one of the sponsors of today's webinar. The other sponsors for today are the Schott Foundation, the Network for Public Education, Local Progress, the Schenker Institute, the National Superintendent's Roundtable, and the National Education Policy Center. Let's get started. Right now, we're at an inflection point with three major crises: the pandemic, institutional racism, and economic disaster. We're seeing large corporations and advocates for privatization take advantage of the crisis. Public education is one of the most important things we do as a society. There are now fundamental questions being asked about who controls our educational system and how does that system function. Massive disruptions have been viewed as a vehicle to advance profit-driven interests into the educational system. For Puerto Rico, Hurricane Maria became an opening to education privatizers, and privatization advocates view the current moment as the ideal opportunity to make a hard push for vouchers. Education advocates around the country are asking, who is doing distance learning best, and attempting to evaluate a system that was created from crisis. Some politicians and tech entrepreneurs have started talking about distance learning being the new normal for public education. But as we know, by talking to almost anyone with children in school, myself included, distance learning cannot be the new normal. There are real questions about the quality of learning that happens without in-person teaching. Large sectors of our community rely on schools to provide much more than just education, and our economic system is based on kids being in school for several hours a day. Over the next hour, we will explore with our panelists whether and how education technology and distance learning can be a useful supplement for our educational system, and what are the challenges and the best ways to address them. Finally, we will pose to our panelists a question on whether this massive disruption to our educational system can be used not as a blunt instrument to privatize, but rather as a strategic opportunity to address the institutional racism that is pervasive throughout this country's institutions. Our panelists today include both folks with expertise derived from their on-the-ground roles as teachers and administrators, as well as academic experts who are exploring these issues in depth. Joining us today are Dr. Gary Miron, professor at Western Michigan University College of Education and Human Development, Dr. Daniela DiGiacomo, assistant professor at the University of Kentucky School of Information Science, Dr. Kiki Ochoa, high school teacher and parent in San Diego Unified School District in California, and Dr. Morsi Speasley, superintendent of the Clayton County School District in Georgia. We're hoping that we can get to some participant questions at the end of our panel discussion. So if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen. Now we'll kick off the panel with Kiki Ochoa for our first question. Kiki, can you tell us about the student body in the school where you teach, and what have been the challenges and the needs for your students?
Thanks, Claire, for the opportunity. Thanks everybody for joining us today. I'm a teacher here in San Diego at Lincoln High School in Southeast San Diego, which is historically, you know, what's the Black community, and it's had a significant demographic shift. There's a lot of Latinx, Latino, Mexicano, Salvadoreño, Central American students now, a large immigrant community. We're riddled with you know, the statistics, right? The underserved community, underprivileged, marginalized, dealing with numerous forms of oppression on a daily basis, working class community. The struggles more recent have surrounded around this whole virtual learning. I teach ethnic studies. I teach AP World this year. I have AVID. I also have regular World mainstream general ed. And it's been a complete contrast. You know, my AP students have thrived. You know, they've been able to connect, you know, virtually. But a lot of my general ed students have struggled mightily. Some of them, due to the coronavirus and the pandemic, have had to move in with family members who can check up on them, watch them, you know, take care of them, provide for them, because a lot of our families are working class, like I mentioned, and they're essential workers and haven't had the privilege to be able to stay at home and take care of their children. So some of them have had to go all the way to Mexico. You know, we're a border city, so I've had to have international phone calls. I was talking to Claire about that earlier, you know, trying to find ways and having to call to Tijuana, Rosarito, even further parts of central Mexico, because they've had to go to families and deal with that. So the issues not only are within Southeast San Diego, but they've become international issues. And the kids that have already been marginalized by our schooling system have been, in my experience, even further marginalized, you know, with this whole virtual learning reality. So it's been an audacious task, right, for me and my colleagues to try to connect with all our students. But you know, we do everything we can. Some of us have gone beyond, you know, our union contracts and given out our personal emails, personal phone numbers, done everything possible. You know, I even contemplated opening up a TikTok, you know, so I can connect with my students some way, somehow, you know, meet them where they are, because we needed to bring them all into the fold so they can get the education that they deserve.
Thanks, Kiki. So Dr. Beasley, can you tell us about your district students and the district's transition to pandemic crisis education? And if you could include in that, what innovative learning has come from that, and how are you addressing the different needs of different groups of students, the kind of issues that Kiki sort of just outlined in San Diego as well?
Thank you, Claire, and thank you to the in the public interest. We're excited. We're here in the Clayton County school system. If you ever landed at the Atlanta airport, you land in Clayton County, if that gives you any perspective. We're south of Atlanta. We have about 55,000 students, 72 plus languages. Most of our students are English speakers, but all of them are learning English. And if the number of languages tell you anything, it lets you see, of course, how diverse we are. All of our students are phenomenal. They're bright students, but they come from a spectrum of households. About 43% of our students, families secure services that qualify our district to provide free and reduced lunch for all of our students here in Clayton County, at least for the next few years. We have dual immersion programs. We have advanced learning for all, where all of our kids in 6th grade take accelerated math towards 8th grade algebra. We have many opportunities for dual enrollment, et cetera, in our school system. All 9th graders are taking, for the most part, most are taking advanced placement courses. We have high expectations, but I can tell you, Claire, when we had to make a decision in collaboration with the Metro Atlanta superintendents to close schools, the first thing we had to do was acknowledge that we were not ready for virtual learning, because we only had 4 schools wherein all the 3rd through 12th graders had devices. we're in the front end of rolling out devices to our students. And we were basically doing it over a 3 to 4 year period because we were waiting on funding. So when we made the decision to close schools, our principals had to immediately assess who had devices, who did not have devices, who had internet, who did not have internet, and basically develop plans to ensure that those students were connected to the learning opportunities. We had to assess to see which teachers, all of our teachers have laptops, but not necessarily internet at their home. So we had to assess that as well. We had to work with our parents to use the devices that they currently have, while at the same time making hard copies of content and resources, ensuring they had textbooks for the students who did not have devices. We had to immediately figure out what we were going to do to ensure that students had a breakfast and a lunch on a daily basis. And so our school nutrition department, while everyone was shutting down, we had to ask for volunteers to basically go to the front lines to ensure that parents and students had an opportunity to pick up meals on a daily basis. We had to figure out, as we started conversing with parents about the virtual learning experience, parents were sharing that they were getting overwhelmed. So we had to implement some structures so that students could spend time so many hours a day in subjects without necessarily feeling like they were missing out in other subjects. And so we had to implement structures at the elementary, middle, and high school levels to acknowledge the frustrations that our parents were experiencing. We had to ensure that our parents knew how to contact their principals, because oftentimes people just run up to the school. Well, if you ran up to the school, no one was there. So we had to ensure that they knew how to contact principals, counselors, social workers. We had to reallocate, or I guess rename some positions. I wouldn't say rename. The word I'm looking for is designate those roles differently. That's what I'm trying to say. Counselors and social workers and SROs, school resource officers, we had to do so many things differently. We had to social workers started delivering meals to families. We had to provide Uber to families to even come get meals. And so we just had to think very innovatively about how to ensure that our students were connected to learning. So to the portion of your question relative to what did we learn? What are we learning? We learned that many families will make it work, but they need our support, as we well knew. But we also began to leverage the tools that we have. We were a Google Classroom environment school district. So we were able to get everyone connected, even though there are some privacy issues that we can talk about later. But we had to get everyone using the tool. We had to show people how to use this iPhone. Other than social media, that was a challenge, and we had to continue to respond to parents who email and said they didn't have tools. But my question was, if you're emailing me, what are you using? Maybe we can turn that into a tool. And so we had to just be very creative and innovative. We've had teachers to go to families' homes and sit in cars and read to kids while they were sitting on porches and steps. And it's just amazing. But fortunately, our parents gave us feedback with all of the challenges that we had, and a lot of kids not necessarily being able to interact every day. About 85% of them gave us an A, B, or C about the process. So, and they knew it was pretty rough on us, but our board since then has voted to purchase devices for every student in grades 3 through 12 and make sure that all K through second grade students have devices when we come back in the fall. So we believe we'll be in a different place as long as we can get those devices from the distributors. And so we're working to do that. Our teachers are training this summer about on-learning, social emotional learning, maximizing the virtual learning environment. And so we're just doing our best to get ready for a different school year next year. So I'll pause there because I could really go on and on about the challenges and the things that we learned in doing this. But we went from 0 to 10 very quickly, very quickly.
Great. Thanks, Dr. Beasley. And we're going to circle back with you towards the ends of the questions to hear more about what are some of the specifics that you're planning as the new school year comes about. I'm going to shift gears a little bit and build off of some of what you said around all the new technology that everybody's needing to learn. And I'm going to turn this one over to Daniela and ask you, so cognizant of some of the unintended consequences that often accompany even the best intentioned of ed tech innovations, what might be some central design principles to consider in designing the online learning experiences, especially hearing what you've just heard from both Kiki and Dr. Beasley?
Yeah, thanks, Claire. That's a great question. And I think what Kiki and Dr. Beasley had just talked about, we're going to have a fruitful discussion today. So thanks for having me. So I think, when I think about that question, as educators and a former teacher myself in the Bay Area and school administrator, I think we tend to focus a lot on how we can be the best teachers and how we can engage in the best teaching. And I think that's important. But I think I would encourage us to think about in this time and in previous times to try to shift that emphasis towards a focus on learning. And that means examining and interrogating what we mean by learning, the theory of learning that's driving our work, and how we're being careful to design for learning in equitable and robust ways. For me, I'm a learning scientist by training, so I was trained to think about learning, admittedly. But for me, my theory of learning is shifting or transforming participation in meaningful sociocultural activity over time. So when I think about how to design for learning environments, I think about things like, are the necessary social conditions there for learning to happen? And Dr. Beasley just spoke to some of this, and Kiki as well. So I think about, is there room for repair? So can students try things out and be comfortable to make mistakes and engage in and try again? That's a central tenet of learning. Is there a sense of social belonging that we're cultivating in these online spaces? So do students feel like they belong, they're accepted for who they are in the moment, in the community in which they're learning? Are there multiple roles for students to try on and participate? So are there roles for more experts, more novices, for a transfer of sort of autonomy and responsibility between students in that space? And is there room to personally contribute to the practices or activities that are going on? So can students contribute their lived experiences and knowledges to the practice of the activity? And again, so if this is how learning happens, that theory of learning, that at least is how I orient my work and think about my work as an educator, that doesn't necessarily shift when we think to an online or virtual space. It gets harder, for me at least, because I'm used to thinking in the face-to-face setting. But it doesn't mean that it's out of reach or that it's impossible. I think that our theory of learning and our theory of equity should still be driving how we think about how to design these online spaces. I just think it's a little bit harder. So we've got to work together and sort of leverage some of the best research on that.
Great, thanks very much, Daniela. So Gary, this isn't the first time that anyone's tried to do virtual school. There are full-time virtual schools already operating in the US. Can you describe this sector and also sum up their performance? Why don't you start with that? I think you're muted, Gary.
Correct. I'm coming from a different perspective than the other panelists because I've been studying online virtual schooling together with our doctoral students over the past decade. We've been compiling annual reports on the existing virtual schools, and it looks very different than what the districts are struggling with and what with solutions they're coming up with today. The existing virtual schools in the country, there are about 500 of them, full-time virtual schools. They serve about 300,000 students. If we look at these, most of them are in the charter school sector. They're online charter schools, and most of the students are enrolled in schools that are for-profit, that are owned and operated for profit by a couple large companies. They look very different from what the possible solutions are today, but I think we've seen a lot from these companies because they are doing a lot of marketing right now, given this opportunity with this disruption. But in terms of the performance of these schools, it's not been good. It's been terrible. In the first year we studied them in 2012, it's been astronomically terrible every single year, where we're seeing a small fraction of these schools meet acceptable ratings from their states. The attrition rates from students, the churn is very high. Graduation rates are dismal. It's across the board. All the outcome measures that we include in our evaluation reports suggest that these schools are failing miserably, and yet they are growing. And the reasons for that failure are there's a number of reasons. One is that these companies, instead of reinvesting in more teachers and improving the model, they are instead investing in purchasing influence, especially in state legislatures. They are investing more in recruitment and advertisement so they can replace the masses of students that are leaving. I think another big failure is that because it's a for-profit driven model that we have in place, they are having enormously large numbers of students per adult or per teacher. So there's insufficient communication and support for students. Students need to be seen and heard, even if it's virtually, and the teachers just can't do it in this model. The kids are left on their own, sometimes without the support or a structured learning environment in the home. So you can imagine after we've been churning out these reports, most of them are at the National Education Policy Center. You imagine I've been labeled a naysayer as somebody who doesn't, who's against these for-profit online schools, who's against virtual schooling. And that's not true. I'm against the current model because it doesn't work, but I do a lot of online instruction myself as a university professor, and I know that it can work. I know that it will be more, with or without a pandemic, we're going to be using these technologies more in blended learning models and in full-time virtual schools also for a small portion of our schools. But I think it can work, but the model, we have to scrap the current model. We've been asking for a moratorium to stop pouring hundreds of millions of dollars into these companies because every year the performance is terrible. We have to stop that. We need a new model, and that model has to have the voices of parents and teachers, researchers, and we have to develop this model with the state agencies, like those people who are responsible for headcount data, the people who are responsible for finance mechanisms and oversight and accountability mechanisms. The for-profit corporate model that's dominant right now is using the fact that we're not up to date with the way we finance and oversee these schools. So we have to rethink these things. The opportunity right now is that districts are getting in the game. They are going to have lower student to teacher ratios. And I think they already have personalized relations with the students. Yes, they are struggling with sudden change, and we have obstacles with technology access and training for the teachers, but I'm optimistic that we're going to see some breakthroughs, but we need to revisit the model and get the model right, and then it can work, I think. But in the meantime, what we have out there, especially in the corporate sector, it's not working.
Thanks, Gary. So to that point, how do we get some of the voices of experts like teachers into the mix to help us think about how to do this the right way? Kiki, let me ask you. So some companies like Summit and Pearson and others, they've already been marketing online tools for in-classroom programs for some time. Given that in the medium term, our K-12 schools are likely to be operating with some sort of hybrid that allows for social distancing, et cetera, what thoughts do you have about how in-school time can be structured to drastically limit screen time when there's in-person instruction? And are there other sort of innovative structural changes to school-based instruction that you think could help yield positive outcome?
You know, in every crisis, right? You know, the sun shines, you know, after the storm. I think we have to look at this global pandemic through that type of a lens. You know, I think unions, teachers, anyone who knows anything about education, have been advocating for smaller class size, you know, for years, right? We know that, you know, when my period 2 is for whatever reason some anomaly and there's only 23 kids in it as compared to 36 in my period 4, you know, there's so much more effective teaching that I can do and learning, like Daniela mentioned, you know, that can take place, you know, in a space where there's less students within those 4 walls of the classroom. So I think, you know, this whole situation in regards to coming back and opening the schools back, we know that there's going to have to be smaller class size. So we have to take advantage of that opportunity. And not only that, but furthermore, you know, we know how effective that's going to be. Once this whole global pandemic is over, we shouldn't go back to the old normal. That should be the new normal, right? Where kids are in rooms with 12 to 20 kids max. And we're able to truly share, learn, build off of one another's ideas. So that's something that we can definitely learn. In regards to the other part of the question, where how can we utilize that? Because maybe we're only going to be able to see our kids face to face once a week, right? I think I'm an ethnic studies teacher, and you know, ethnic studies is grounded in this concept of love, right? Love of self, love of community, love of family, love of your neighbors, love of everybody in the world. And I think that's exactly what we should be trying to focus on. You know, if I was in charge of, I was a superintendent of superintendents, you know, I would be changing and adding another content area, not only English, science, math, you know, and social studies, but a content of love, right? To make sure that students understand, you know, how important it is, especially in a global pandemic, to think outside of self, right? In the current crisis that we're dealing with as a nation, in regards to the Black Lives Matter movement, to think about someone other, to suspend our ego, right? And to be empathetic towards others, towards humanity, towards our sisters and brothers in different communities. I think obviously I'm biased in that regard, but I think that's the most important thing that we need to be teaching, and we could do that through math. We could do that through science. We could do that through art. We could do that through social studies. We could do that through reading and writing, through physical education. There's no reason why, and we have to take advantage, and not to say that we haven't, but the time is going to be precious. Maybe Monday normally isn't so, we don't feel as it being so urgent because we're going to see them on Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. But if we only are going to see them on Monday, we should squeeze every second, appreciate the fact that there's 12, 20 miracles that just walked into our room despite all the things that they have to deal with at their age, and take advantage of it. And that should be the new normal. When we go back, let's not take those beautiful days and those beautiful children for granted.
Thanks, Kiki. So sort of following up a little bit on that theme about our students coming from really different places. Dr. Beasley, for many students and for a number of reasons, their homes cannot serve as an appropriate educational space. Brick and mortar schools play a critical role for many students as a safe space. For many, the most reliable source of food, et cetera. How does this not get lost and actually get expanded to include more needed services as we continue to rely more on online learning?
Claire, I was listening to Kiki and I agree with everything he shared, but I can assure you that our community and communities around the nation, they're not going to do away with public schools, period. Public schools are going to occur as all of us experience. Parents have got to get back to work. Learning has to occur. And we know, while we appreciate the tools, we appreciate distance learning, we know that learning involves that social human contact, that interaction. And so we're not going to disband our schools because of this pandemic. After this pandemic, we may innovate more, and we should, but our schools are relevant. Relative to the virtual schools, there will never be enough virtual schools to support our families and what they expect of our public schools. And so rest assured, all of us who are K-12 public educators, our public schools are not going anywhere. And if it's up to me and Kiki, I can assure you they won't be going anywhere. But I will say this, our families, they need our schools, they need the teachers. I mean, I had educated, degreed parents who are saying, I need my child to go back to that teacher because that teacher has been prepared, trained to teach my child, special education, ESOL, etc. Our community, they've been very clear. They appreciate what our teachers, our principals, and others have done throughout this pandemic. They want their children to come back and be safe, but they expect our schools to open. They expect for a decision to be made for students to come back for that face-to-face human touch experience. We'll continue to use the tools, virtual learning, and we had it, fortunately, here in Georgia, we have a statewide virtual academy. We have been using tools virtually in our district. But the truth of the matter is, those are just tools. Learning has to occur. If that tool helps a student to learn, great. But there are many students for which those tools are not very helpful. And therefore, we've got to meet the needs of our students. And so schools are safe. Schools, kids can get great breakfast and lunch at school, even when they're not at school. As many of us have seen throughout this pandemic, we're providing our families resources and meals. Partners are working with us to ensure that they have groceries, etc. Schools are not going anywhere. And anybody who convinces themselves that for some reason we're going to move 50 million plus children to virtual learning, you probably are not the smartest person sitting on the log, because parents in America will not allow it.
Thanks, Dr. Beasley. So just feeding off of what you were just talking about the need for actual learning and these tools, I'm going to shift over to Daniela. Before I ask this question, I just want to remind people, if you have questions, to go ahead and write them in the Q&A. We won't get to every single one, but we'll get to a few. So Daniela, can you tell us, how can research support practice to design for equitable learning experiences as schools continue to use these online tools? And how do we figure out if kids are actually learning?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. I want to just agree with everything Dr. Beasley just said. Schools need to open back up. We're going. In addition to thinking about, again, thinking first about how we're conceptualizing and evidencing learning, that's got to guide your tools for evaluation and measurement of that learning, right? But in addition, I would say, if we really want to make sure and figure out how kids are learning, we have to ask them, right? And I don't mean ask them, traditional, what did you learn today type of thing.
Right.
We have developed suites of tools and among many research practice partnerships that I'm happy to share these resources with thinking about how are we including kids themselves and students in the design of some of these experiences? So are their lived experiences, cultures, realities actually built into the design of the learning and teaching activities? And so, especially now working within such variable learning from home context, I think something that we've got to continue to think about, as Dr. Beasley said, is that it's not an equitable playing field at home right now, and kids are learning in very different environments. But there's actually amazing research going on in the moment. I'll have to shout out a group here in Kentucky that I work with called the Student Voice Team, and they are a student voice organization of students from across 120 counties in Kentucky. And they rapidly responded to COVID to design a student-to-student study called Coping with COVID that looks into the quality and equality of students' learning experiences from home. Within 24 hours, they had 5,000 responses. We now have 12,000 survey responses that really dig deep into how students are experiencing this crisis, in particular with regard to their learning. And so not just about how many devices they have at home or not, but are they back to work? Are their parents working? Have their parents lost a job? Have they lost loved one to the virus? That sort of information, and we're now set to propose that the findings from that work to the Kentucky Board of Education in August. But the students need to be part of the discussion and the design of what happens in relation to the crisis. And as evidenced by 12,000 survey responses within a short period, if we want this stuff done, give it to the students to do and include their voices, because they're a big part of, we can only measure so much from an external perspective about how students are learning. They've got to be included in that design and evaluation.
Great, thanks, Daniela. So Gary, let me get into a little more of the technical here. So given that the digital divide, and not just access to internet, but access to devices, space, time to concentrate, technical support, given that that digital divide is really a manifestation of systemic racism and economic inequality, how can we make sure that increased use of online learning does not exacerbate those problems? Is this an opportunity to address some of the causes of the digital divide?
Yes, we already have something that educators are well aware of and researchers we know of, because we measure student learning, and we see that low-income students tend to have what we call the summer slide, where they have measurable decreases in knowledge over the summer based on state assessments. And now many of us were talking about the COVID slide, which is going to be a longer period of time where many of the lower income families are not going to have access to structured learning environments, to enrichment activities. And so and right now with this shift, they don't always have the same access with the equipment and internet access to learning materials and curriculum. So the big concern right now is that things may worsen, and it's systemic. It's right now, just if I put on my professor's hat very briefly, over time we see this shift, this pendulum, where the government sees education as a tool as a public good, and sometimes they see it as a private good. Right now, we're in that pendulum is swinging. We're still seeing education as a private good. Parents made good choices. Parents made bad choices. Their children will suffer the consequences. And we're not seeing education as a tool to unify our nation, to heal the wounds of racism, to address these inequities. And we need to see education as that type of tool so that we can address these things. And that means we have to change our thinking about education to see it as a public good rather than a private good. And of course, that means a large shift in the thinking of our policymakers right now. But right now, I'm not optimistic because of the disparities and access, disparities in funding, disparity and outcomes. It's going to be a lot to address these, but I think there's greater awareness of some of these issues. And if we have hopefully we'll see a shift, and maybe that pendulum is going to come back, and we're going to see like, hey, we've got an education system. This is a tool that can be used to address some of these ills in society. Let's fund it appropriately and let's use it for these purposes.
Great, thanks, Gary. So we're going to move into our last two questions for the panel before we go to Q&A. My last specific question is for Dr. Beasley. As we're looking forward and thinking about the coming school year, where there are families that will need to continue distance learning due to vulnerable family members, but there's also many families and children that need in-person schooling. How are you thinking about the coming year in your district?
Well, I can tell you this, we're ready for our students to come back to school, but we recognize, we've heard from our parents, we've got about 70% who are uncomfortable with students coming back, even with safety guidelines. We've got staff members who have concerns. So we're looking at a few models here in Clayton County. We're looking at a face-to-face model, all predicated upon the data and what the data is telling us relative to the pandemic. We're looking at a full virtual learning model. We're going to just learn from the use of the platform that we currently have, even as we expand and secure a learning management system. But we're just going to have to make it work. But we're looking at a blended approach depending upon the data, where we may bring half of the students back on certain days, the other half on other days, and then of course still provide all of them a tool to connect to virtual learning for asynchronous learning, if that's the best approach for those students. And then we're looking at offering our parents who are just absolutely convinced that they need their children to be at home, but learning all day, every school day. We're looking at a virtual learning academy. And so right now, we're looking at 4 models, and we're going to make it work with those 4 models. Our parents understand that we're trying to balance their concerns with what the data is telling us from our Board of Health, CDC, and others, but we're also looking at our budgets as well. And so we're trying to balance all of those, oftentimes very competing priorities, with competing priorities. But we're going to make it work. I think our community will be very pleased. We'll be sharing with our community June 22nd, our various models and what actions we'll need of them. But I think that our parents will appreciate the models. They're members of our task force that are making some very informed decisions. And we've been having various opportunities around the county to share, getting their feedback, and we'll do some Facebook Live sessions to share and to also entertain their questions or respond to their questions. And so not a one-sided approach, but a flexible, innovative, choice-driven approach that I believe will meet the needs of this community. And I think that's what we have to be doing with districts across the nation, being flexible, figuring out ways to get kids back in school, but also acknowledge that families, parents, they're in different places, different spaces, they have different concerns, and we want to ensure, and we don't want to lose our students to private schools. I'll be very honest with you, not that that really concerns me, because I often tell people that if private schools wanted to educate most children, it would have been done. And since it hadn't been done, we know that's not the case.
Thanks, Dr. Beasley. So now I'm going to ask the final question of our panelists before we move to the audience Q&A. So this is a question we have for all panelists. So while most of this conversation is about the changes that should be made as a result of the pandemic, right now is also a major inflection point in how our country grapples with racism. Is there an opportunity to address institutional racism within our educational system at this time when there's a major flux in the system? And we're happy to hear from all of you. And
well, if I can piggyback on Gary's comment, about schools being a tool, right, for a public good. You know, I like that way of looking at it. I've taught AP US her story, right? It doesn't have to be his story, right? For a bunch of years, and in the chapter in the Brickley book, which is the book that you're supposed to use, right? That College Board, you know, for the AP exams, etc. In the chapter about education and the establishment of this beautiful institution that that opportunists are trying to privatize, right? You know, especially considering the current crisis. This is a quote. It says, "Schools were set up to Americanize slaves and Indians and have them embrace white civilization. The main objective was to replace their collective culture with capitalist individualism." So that's not me talking, right? That's in the book, and that's Alan Brinkley, you know, breaking down how schools were established. So the question that we have to ask ourselves is, are we still that tool, right? It wasn't a tool for public good like Gary's talking about. It was a tool to Americanize, right? Or assimilate or colonize, depending on the word that you prefer to use. So I think what has to happen is it's really easy for us, you know, as educators to engage our students in conversations about how they can change the world, right? Because things are not the way they should be. You know, but I think it's a friend of mine, Guillermo, he always says, es mejor, no puede ser la luz de la calle si no tienes las luces de tu casa están apagadas. You can't be the light in the streets if the lights at home are off. So I think as educators, it's time to look at our institution, right, as schools, and how we perpetuate systematic and institutional racism. Because there's a lot of inequities that take place. You know, there's school police on campus that sometimes get a little too heavy-handed, right? Especially on my campus. That's happened historically. There's a reason why, there's only a few people of color that have these 3 letters behind their name, like Dr. Beasley here. There's so many reasons why education is constantly reproducing, the same exact results it's had 30, 40, 50, 60 years from now. So if we don't start to interrogate the curriculum that we're teaching, right, the policies that our districts are bringing down, all the way up to Betsy DeVos. Think about who's in charge of public education on a national level. An opportunist who wants to privatize education and doesn't care about, our kids, right? The public good that education could be utilized for, right? To make sure that you create unity and you build this whole concept of love everybody on the planet and take a stand. And I've always sounded crazy to folks, but maybe now with all the conditions and the fact that we have the time, to actually start thinking and talking and building, we can actually create some real concrete change that'll help my kids who are 7 to 9 years old have a better world in the future.
Thanks, Kiki. Dr. Beasley, Daniela, Gary, would you like to jump in on this?
Well, I want to say that I want everyone to observe, because I'm African American, but I believe the strategy now is because African Americans have carried this burden for many years. So I'm going to defer to my counterparts on this panel, because we've spoken up and we've tried to address things for many years. It's time for the others. It's time for white Americans and Hispanics and Asians. It's time for everyone else to help carry this burden and to change things for all, in particular African Americans and everyone else who's negatively impacted by systemic racism. So I'm deferring to my colleagues, and of course, I have an opinion if you all would love to hear my opinion.
Sure, I'll say a few words. So thanks, Dr. Beasley. Yeah, I mean, we've long needed to center the voices, experiences, bodies, and knowledges of students and families of colors. That's not new. I mean, this political moment may be making that more visible for some, but for many, that's long been the case and been very known. But we don't just need to center the experiences. We need to also step back as white folks, right? And look at the ways in which we are that our own lives are intertwined with the lives of others. We can rely on many scholars of color, seminal scholars like Bell Hooks, contemporary scholars like Ibrahim Kendi, Jeff Duncan Andrade. These people have showed us, what it's like and outlined how to educate in a humanizing and a just conferring way, because we're not doing that. And we can be doing that so much better. And we can look at all these instances right now to look at that. And education is I still remain hopeful in the power of education to be that tool for the public good, because despite how segregated schools are, they're still less segregated than when we go outside of them, right? So there's still hope within our schools that they can be the places to foster empathy and civil discourse and an understanding of how deeply intertwined we are as a global community. They have to be. We have to hope that they are, right? And so I think that, yeah, I mean, we need to consider as educators and designers how to not just design for students who look like us, sound like us, feel like us. We need to think about student as all of our children. And we live in segregated, siloed spaces, but we have to work against that actively and at every intersection, right? And as Kendi talks about in his recent book, it's not a one and done. You're not just anti-racist at one time, or you can't check off a box that you can be an ally, so to speak. These are practices that you have to engage in on a daily basis, and they have to constitute and shape your interactions. And you have to build in time for reflection and room for repair, because we're going to make mistakes, but we have to try a heck of a lot harder than we're trying now.
Thanks, Daniela. Gary?
Just, I touched on this in my last response, but that addressing the inequities, and we can't do this piecemeal, it's systemic, which means that we have to look at it holistically and in all aspects. If we're looking at education, it's access, it's funding, it's not only the outcomes and looking at the gaps, but understanding how those gaps occurred, but it's looking at curriculum and who's coming into our teaching forces right now. There's just so many aspects where we have disparities and inequity, and we have to look at this systemically, because it is a systemic problem.
Thanks, Gary.
Claire, if I could just ask, I'll be very practical in my response, if I may. If you look at your administration and your administration is not reflective of the students that they serve, then you're the problem. If you have not been intentional about changing that, if you walk into a classroom with all advanced placement students and they're all white instead of a reflection of the population of the school, then you have been a part of the problem. If you walk into a corporation or anywhere, if you're a part of these structures and these systems that have ignored, then it's time to stop ignoring. It's time to be courageous. It's time to implement some actions. Don't just talk about it, but get about it. Do something about it. Families do not want to be poor. Families do not want to be at the wrong end of society or at the bottom of society. I don't know of a child or a family who just wants to not be successful, but there are systems and structures in place that contribute to that, and we've got to acknowledge that. And those of us who are in positions of privilege, power, and influence, get up and do something to change it.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. That was great. So given that we've got several hundred people on here listening to all this fantastic information, I want to get a chance to get to some of their questions as well. So we have a few minutes here. So I'm going to start with, and I want to say there's a lot of questions, a lot of great questions. There's some questions that are directed towards specific panelists, and for those we don't get to right now, we will actually send those questions along to the panelists so that they can respond following after this panel. But let me start with one question from Wendy Bariso. It says, I'm a special education teacher of students with severe disabilities. I teach in San Diego Unified School District. I'm very concerned for this population. These kids are severely impacted. So do any of you feel like you'd like to address this question? We'll just ask one or two of you to address this question about how do we manage the needs of severely disabled students in this unusual environment?
I can start, then I'll kick it to someone else. One thing that we're trying to do is, as we're looking at our models, we're learning what worked during this time that we were out of school with virtual learning, but we're also ensuring that we have some options for our parents and families that have students with special needs. We cannot approach everyone the same way, and that's one thing we're learning, and that's important for all of us to acknowledge. And so we've got to, find virtual ways, physical ways to actually meet the needs of every student. And so we're trying to learn from what worked over the spring in an effort to ensure that we have a better fall and that those students, most importantly, are getting the services and the support that they need. Virtual opportunities, virtual therapy, but face-to-face visits, home visits, etc. We're just trying to figure out the best way to mobilize those resources to support our students where they are.
Great. Anyone else want to add anything on that? We've got other questions too, but if anyone else wants to jump in, that's fine. Okay, let's move on to another question. So given that, at least for the short term, many of us will have to be teaching in a remote environment, how does the panel view quote unquote live online learning, synchronous learning, versus traditional online learning, asynchronous learning? And more specifically, are there particular features of live online that make it a preferred mode of remote learning?
I can address that. I teach online courses, 3 or 4 online courses per year. With these learning platforms today, you can simulate group activities. You can do all kinds of activities just like I would do in a classroom. The research is showing that people tend to have a little bit more fatigue when they're online and trying to be attentive rather than in face-to-face environments. So I usually keep my synchronous events shorter, but combining both synchronous and asynchronous is really important. And I think the one challenge right now for our primary and secondary school teachers is we depend on them teaching 21st century skills. Imparting knowledge, our sense of knowledge is, and where we get it is changing, but the way we teach and learn skills is so critical. You know, the communication skills, collaboration, problem solving, creativity. How do we do this online? That's going to be challenging, but I think, you know, the knowledge part is our sense of how kids are going to get access and use knowledge is changing, but the skills and teaching those skills in a virtual environment is going to be challenging. Is probably going to be the subject of some upcoming research that Daniela and some others will be investigating, I hope.
If I could speak to that as well, you know, I have the twofold perspective, right? I was teaching both live Zoom sessions. You know, I had my Google Classroom where kids would jump in throughout the week and do some work, and then I had a first grader and a third grader, right, in my house. You know, doing both. You know, virtual classes and stuff online, and it was a lot to try to manage, especially, you know, I thought I had excellent Wi-Fi, but when I had to do my Zoom classes, I'd have my kids, you know, get off their laptops and stop their classes, right, their work. And my Wi-Fi is the best, you know, this community's got, you know, and I struggled with that. So, you know, it's just so difficult, you know, to do that, but it was extremely important for the kids to connect. But at the same time, like I mentioned at the very beginning, it was hard for some students. The bandwidth that they had, you know, the access that they had, you know, some of them were, like I said, in Mexico, and some of my colleagues, you know, and it was kind of hard. We were learning right through the process. We didn't know how much work was work. I've heard from parents saying that their children were doing work all night. You know, I know that the work that my kids were doing, like, I'm an educator, my wife is an educator. It was so hard to support my 2 children, first grade, third grade content. I can only imagine a working class parent who doesn't have the time to sit, you know, who isn't an educator and struggling with this virtual stuff. So there's nothing that can replace face-to-face. There is nothing. You know, this is cool. I use facets of technology in our classrooms, but we can never, like Dr. Beasley mentioned, you know, parents will, there's no way. We need human interaction, right? That's 3D, 4D, we're 1000D, right? You know, face-to-face.
Daniela, did you want to jump in as well?
Just a small note to say that I think that the asynchronous, synchronous question, at least, I mean, even in the higher ed context now where I'm teaching and I support Jefferson County Public Schools as well, Louisville here, I think that it's a real equity issue to, you know, mandate synchronous sessions for your students. And so at the University of Kentucky, we didn't do that. And I think but I went I chose then as a teacher to offer both, to say, here's what you can do, here's what I'd like you to do asynchronously, but I'm going to be here for you like 3 times a week for these many hours. And those sessions were critical, again, for questions around social engagement and processing and a lot of the SEL sort of components of learning. But they were also really, because I teach classes around critical thinking and information literacy, that was where the rich discussion was continuing. But I think from, again, from an equity perspective, it can't be just an either or one way. It's got to be a both and a context dependent, because so many of our students, as we know, are back to work, are back home with their families, are sharing devices, are in homes where it's louder or less quiet or with less Wi-Fi, and we can't expect certain hours of the day that work for us to work for our students.
Great, thanks.
Claire, if I could just add, I think regardless of the mode that you use, quality instruction is so important. I was invited in during the pandemic. I was invited into a few classrooms to have conversations with teachers and students. And I was always impressed when the teacher who was on one end of the device and students on the other end, when they were engaging with one another. So the tool was helpful to connect kids to their teachers and teachers to their kids. But the quality of instruction is so important in helping
Absolutely.
teachers and others have the strategies to keep kids engaged, to think critically, to be creative using the tools. And that's part of our work as a school system, to provide the support and training for that to occur consistently in every classroom.
Thank you. Yeah. So there's a lot of really great questions. I'm going to take 1 or 2 more. I think we'll just go over our 1 o'clock end time by a couple minutes so we could fit in a couple more questions. So there's one question that says, can you talk about the role of education support professionals, cafeteria workers, bus drivers, et cetera, to help in this new environment?
I'll start out and then I'll pitch it to someone else. Their role is critical. As you know, we're talking about how our bus drivers will basically continue to transport our kids and what role they have as soon as the kids step on that bus or approach the bus in the morning. Our school nutrition workers, we may have to create teams of bus drivers and school nutrition workers and others to ensure that kids who are virtually learning all day, every day, have meals. And so the roles may have to be repurposed or redefined, if you will. But I'm pleased to share that our employees, all I see are individuals who know that we as adults, we've got to do something different to ensure that our kids are taken care of. And that's exactly what they're doing. And so we're just trying to bring everybody to the table to figure out exactly what we need to do for the various models that we have, and we're going to get it done for our kids.
Great, thanks. All right, one final question, and then we'll move to wrap up. And we've got a lot of other good questions, so I just apologize we can't get to everybody's. So given that districts will be buying new services and technologies, how do we pick and choose services and contracts with companies that will best serve our students and do the least harm to student privacy and the least harm around privatization?
I think the evaluation findings are in on the large corporations that are pumping the airwaves full of advertisements right now. They are expensive and they are profit driven, and they are not serving the interests of our children nor taxpayers. And I think I'm really excited. I mean, there are a number of learning platforms out there that districts can purchase and access without going to the big online school operators. And but populating those platforms with their curriculum. But the heart and soul of this education is the teacher. It's and that's something that can't be replaced. But I think that we have to be very cautious of all the advertisement we're seeing pumped out and the pitches being made to districts and schools right now, and to parents to switch from their district schools to go to these online schools, because year after year they are failing miserably.
Thanks, Gary. So we'll wrap it up there. I'm going to give each panelist an opportunity to just make a brief final comment. But obviously, we've heard a lot of really great information here today. And I know a lot of the participants here are advocating around what the conditions of school will be like when it reopens in the fall. And I think you've given us a lot for people to be able to incorporate and use in their advocacy. Just so our participants know, we'll be sending an email to all of our participants with a survey to get all of your feedback on how this panel went. And we'll also be sending a link to all participants with a recording of today's webinar. So before we stop, I'm just gonna give the panelists one more moment to share some final thoughts, about a minute apiece. I'm gonna start in my bottom left. Kiki, do you wanna give us your closing thought?
You know, I start my class every day with en la quech, which is an indigenous concept. You know, tú eres mi otro yo, you are my other me. Si te hago daño a ti, if I do harm to you, me hago daño a mí mismo, I do harm to myself. Si te amo y respeto, if I love and respect you, me amo y respeto yo, I love and respect myself. That's how I start my class. It frames the day. You know, those are the rules, right? The guidelines. And, you know, that's what we got to do. We could teach love, right? And unity. You know, a filmmaker in 90 minutes can make us fall in love with fictitious characters, right? And we'll cry at the end when something bad happens to them. I think if we got kids every single day, we could teach them to feel the pain of different communities, right? Of their neighbors, of their families, of other people's families, of someone other than self. And that starts with loving yourself. It's hard to love others if you don't love who you are and where you came from. So we need to teach the kids who they are, where they came from, so they know where they're going. So muchas gracias, you know, to everybody.
Thanks, Kiki. Daniela?
I don't really want to follow that one up. I would just agree. Thanks, Kiki, for that. But I think that just moving forward, if there's a lot, I know that there's probably a lot of district partners and school teachers. I mean, just to say thanks for everyone for trying to come together at this time. Thanks for being here. And I would say continue to include the voices of students and parents and families and teachers and paraprofessionals in these discussions, because there's no greater time right now to sort of become a pluralistic democracy and sort of have all of our voices heard. So I think maybe no greater time to focus on educating for empathy and civic engagement and thinking about how to support the sociopolitical development of our young people to be as they are and as they will become.
Thanks, Daniela. Gary?
Yeah, I think many of us know already because states are announcing it, but there's going to be austerity measures come the fall. And the timing couldn't be worse for education. States have to balance their budget. The federal government hasn't really stepped in yet to support states in the schools. But with the last recession, we saw drastic cuts in education. Many states still haven't recovered from those funding cuts. They can't cut many sectors. Healthcare is privatized. The military has a special interest that's at the federal level. State policymakers, they are going to cut schools. That's the only big sector they have. They hold the purse strings for. And the timing couldn't be worse because this is a generation of children right now that have so many issues to address. Not only with the issues of inequity and the institutional racism, but the problems with our divided nation, frankly. And then on top of all of this, this is a generation, this is a cohort of students that are going to be paying for the national debt that's accrued in recent years and now as a result of the government's response to the pandemic. So we're going to be asking so much of this generation right at the time we are going to be cutting them. And that concerns me greatly. And I think we need our policymakers to look at the urgency of and the importance of our education sector for addressing these issues, serving as that tool, but also preparing these youth because we are so dependent on them, frankly, to pay off all this debt.
Thanks for that, Gary. And I'm going to give the final word to Dr. Beasley.
Well, thank you, Claire. In the public interest, I would just say ditto to what everyone has said. We need great teachers like Kiki. I need partners like Daniela to help us, figure out the best approaches. I need a voice like Gary to help advocate for policies, but I need all of the participants and all of us to know that there are no silver bullets, that technology is a tool, but we are the solution. We, the humans, the people, we are the solution. So if we want to solve, whether it be systemic racism, we can solve that. We're the solution. Whether it be a lack of funding, we've got enough money to solve some of the issues in education. We are the solution. So I encourage all of us to just put on the mindset that I'm the solution and work collaboratively with others to figure out what needs to be done, always focusing on our children and doing what's best for our children. Just remember again, we are the solution.
Thanks again. And so thanks again to our panelists, Dr. Morcis Beasley, Dr. Daniela Di Giacomo, Dr. Gary Miron, and Dr. Kiki Ochoa. Thanks to all of our sponsors, and thanks once again to everybody who participated. And you'll be getting a follow-up email from us with a survey. And feel free, we will share these remaining questions with our panelists and hopefully be able to get back in touch with everybody. So that concludes our webinar.